a subtle thing, but yeah, there was a little bit of I planned for that, but probably wing it. It might not make the most sense, but I think it'll work.
So the YouTube stream is going now.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. Should I go ahead and get started, or what do you think? Okay, I'm gonna get started. All right, well, welcome everyone to the Earth to Earth seminar. Thank you for joining us today, the 12th of November, 2020. Please visit our website, earth2earthseminar.com, for further information about the series. Earth to Earth is organized by a governing board with representation from UK universities, Nature Geoscience, and the British Geological Survey. And any UK institution that wishes to have a representative on the board should contact us by email. We also welcome student societies from participating institutions to get in touch with us to co-organize and promote seminars. It's our mission at Earth to Earth to engage the UK geosciences community with inspiring science from internationally leading researchers. And we hope to do this while promoting inclusivity and diversity, supporting the advancement of early career researchers, and highlighting geoscientists' contributions to addressing global environmental challenges. Earth to Earth seminars take place every 2 weeks at this time and day, and they're open to everyone. You can join either via the Zoom webinar or via the live stream on YouTube. The lecture will be recorded and, with speaker permission, will be available on the YouTube channel with closed captioning. Calendar links and further information are on the earth2earthseminar.com webpage. During seminars, we ask that you follow our code of conduct, which you can find on the Earth to Earth webpage. Again, and for questions at the end of the talk, please use the Q&A channel on the bottom of your Zoom window. You can post these at any time during the seminar, and anyone can upvote questions that they like. And we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for me to relay your questions to the speakers. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's co-speakers. We are fortunate to have Professor Jennifer Macalady from Penn State University and Professor Mark Torres from Rice University. Jen is a professor in the Department of Geosciences at Pennsylvania State University. She did her PhD in soil science at UC Davis and postdoctoral work at Madison and UC Berkeley before joining the staff at Carleton College in 2002 and then at Penn State in 2004. Dr. Mark Torres is a professor in the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Rice University in Houston. He received a PhD in geochemistry from USC and did a postdoc at Caltech before joining the staff at Rice in 2017. Mark and Jen are going to be speaking today about strong acid and the role of microorganisms in sulfuric acid weathering in the global carbon cycle. Thank you, Jen and Mark, and please take it away.
Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about this topic of strong acid weathering, which has sort of been very interesting to me. I had anticipated going second, and it seems like I might be going first. So I'll try to fill in the knowledge gaps that I kind of didn't plan for. So kind of at a place to start, we can sort of say, well, what is strong acid weathering? So the idea is that certain mineral phases, particularly things like metal sulfide minerals in the presence of oxygen, break down producing sulfuric acid. And that sulfuric acid is very reactive in the environment and can drive lots of interesting chemistry. And that's the basic premise we're interested in studying. But to start thinking about that topic, we can maybe go all the way back in time to when did this first start? When was the first time in Earth's history when we were allowed to do strong acid weathering? And it's the case that Earth's atmosphere today is oxygenated, something like 21%, but it's not always been the case. And we have here maybe what is a schematic hypothesis for how oxygen levels have evolved over the course of Earth's history. And so x-axis is time, and the y-axis is the amount of CO2, or sorry, amount of O2 in the atmosphere, either in atmospheres or as sort of ratio to the modern, this present atmospheric level. And prior to the evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis, there was really low levels of oxygen in the atmosphere, and maybe sometime coincident with the evolution of this metabolism, we see this first appearance of oxygen in the atmosphere, or the Great Oxidation event. And this is really important for this topic of strong acid weathering, because it turns out that oxygen is a critical ingredient for strong acid generation. And so I was mentioning before, here are these metal sulfide minerals. These are pyrites, and these are some drill cores from the Witwatersrand Basin in South Africa. And you can see these are rounded, and they're rounded because they were transported in a river. And we call this sort of detrital pyrite. And this form of pyrite no longer exists, right? In the presence of oxygen, metal sulfides are too reactive to withstand fluvial transport and this kind of sort of abrasion. And this sort of rock, which is from the Archean, or this period of low oxygen, is sort of this, again, this kind of direct evidence that prior to the GOE, we weren't able to generate something like sulfuric acid from the oxidation of sulfide minerals. And this has led a lot of people to be really interested, well, what happens when the oxygen goes up just a little bit and we are able to start having strong acid play some role in the Earth system? And I just highlighted these 4 papers here. I don't really want to talk about them in much detail, just to sort of say that there's been a lot of interest and excitement about this topic, or what happens when we get our first taste of strong acid weathering. And what I'm going to focus on today instead is, well, once we have it, right, sort of Earth's atmosphere remain oxygenated for the rest of Earth's history, what role has it played in global biogeochemical cycles? And I'm particularly interested in this question of what role strong acid weathering may have played in Earth's climate system, with the kind of motivation there that Earth's climate is intimately tied to its habitability. We can think about one component of habitability being needing to sustain liquid water, or the temperatures compatible with liquid water or surface. And sort of to think about, well, how does Earth do that? We really introduce the carbon cycle. So we can sort of think about what we might call the long-term carbon cycle, or this is sort of this supply of CO2 to superficial reservoirs as a consequence of volcanic and metamorphic degassing, and also sedimentary recycling. Once it's at the surface, the CO2 can be partitioned between the ocean, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. And ultimately, it leaves through the burial of organic and inorganic carbon. And we think that sort of water-rock interactions, or collectively what we call weathering, are key to this carbon cycle. And we can kind of see that in these sort of schematic reactions, where we take something like a calcium silicate mineral, which might be on land, and it can react chemically with CO2 dissolved in water, which forms a weak acid. And that liberates dissolved calcium ions and alkalinity and like sort of bicarbonate. These are transported by rivers to the ocean, where biota can combine them to make solid phase inorganic carbon, or calcium carbonate. And we sort of think that the rate limiting step here is this weathering reaction. And so it's maybe to first order reasonable to say that the rate at weathering sets the rate of carbon burial in this inorganic form, or how much carbon is removed from the surface. And this removal rate is super important. And so we can kind of see that in this plot up here. This is from this Berner and Caldier paper. And I like this plot a lot. It's a very simple model. We can just sort of say, well, the time rate of change of carbon at the surface is the difference between what's coming in and what's coming out. And we can arbitrarily impose an imbalance. We can say, well, the input's 25% bigger than the output, or vice versa, the output's 25% bigger than the input. And in response to that imbalance, we can see what the atmosphere does. And in either case, it sort of radically changes its concentrations on these sort of million-year timescales. Either it gets too hot and everything dies, or too cold and everything dies. And so we need some way of keeping input and output fluxes in the carbon cycle close in magnitude if we want kind of sustained habitability of our planet. And that has been this big open question, like how really does that work? That has motivated a lot of research in the field, including some of my own. And to kind of sort of further develop that point, like why are we worried about imbalances, we can sort of point to time periods of Earth's history where we could conceive of an imbalance arising. And with that, I kind of want to look at this Ramo uplift weathering hypothesis. So this came out in sort of late 80s. And this is this idea that did increasing rates of global uplift and erosion drive Cenozoic cooling. And so the idea is, if you look at records, so here, sort of this paper by Frédéric Herman, sort of mapping out globally with thermochronology data, is the erosion rate today higher than it was, let's say, 6 million years ago? And in most places that people have looked, that is the case, these sort of darker colors. And we can sort of add them up globally. These sort of boxes are the global rate of erosion over the last, say, 8 million years. And it's coincident with this change in climate. And that's measured in this blue and red by a change in the oxygen isotope composition of the ocean. Now, this sort of trend, we think, extended earlier, let's say, out to 40, 50 million years. And so it's been a really long-term feature of sort of the Cenozoic. But I'm just sort of zooming in on this sort of recent period where we have sort of better data. And the reason we might plausibly link erosion and climate change is sort of shown here in this figure from Isaac Larson, where we're measuring in modern catchments the erosion rate, as well as on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the weathering rate. And you can see there's this positive relationship, which would imply if we were to increase erosion, we would increase weathering. And in the case, this sort of idea that weathering is this rate limiting step for carbon burial, you might reasonably interpret that this means that carbon burial went up. And if we have more carbon burial, that'd be taking carbon out of the atmosphere and driving cooling. Now, the problem is, how do we do this and satisfy mass balance? This is that figure I showed before, right? The system's very sensitive. And so how did the Earth system know to increase the imbalance a little bit so that we got cooling, but not too much that we took all of the CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? We just don't really understand that component, right? We know CO2 didn't go completely out of the atmosphere, but we don't understand why. What was keeping erosion in check so as not to overwhelm the sort of stability of the carbon cycle? And to explore that specific question, we started looking at the Andes Amazon as this kind of natural laboratory. And so this is sort of field work I did for my PhD, where we went along a transect from the sort of Andes Mountains to the Amazon floodplain in Peru. And you can kind of see here this sort of steep mountain catchments or these sort of flat lowland catchments. And the idea here is we can sort of trade space for time and sort of look at places where uplift rates are very high and erosion rates are very high, and also places where they're much lower, and sort of compare like what is the effect of uplift on weathering. We have this evidence that it increases the total amount of weathering, but that's not the same thing as what it's doing to the carbon cycle. Like what is actually that weathering, what's its actual impact on CO2 in the atmosphere? And to sort of calculate the actual impact, we sort of go to these rivers and we take samples of the sort of river water, we measure its chemical composition, and we translate that chemical composition into a CO2 effect. And there are many, many steps in that translation. And I'm going to gloss over most of them. But what I want to highlight is kind of this broad framework we have for thinking about this. So what we ultimately care about is CO2 in the atmosphere. And it turns out, though, that there's much more carbon in the ocean than there is in the atmosphere. And they relate to each other via gas exchange. And so to first order, kind of on geologic timescales, we can say that the PCO2, or the sort of partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the ocean, is the same thing as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If the ocean CO2 goes up because it has more carbon, that's going to force the atmospheric CO2 to go up. Now, to understand ocean CO2, we need to know two things. And those two things are going to set these chemical equilibria that control the distribution between all these different inorganic carbon species, sort of dissolved CO2, bicarbonate, or carbonate ion. And the two tracers we're going to pay attention to are alkalinity and dissolved organic carbon, because these directly relate to the chemical weathering reactions we're interested in. Alkalinity is this sort of convoluted concept relating to acid buffering capacity, but to first order, we can say it's the difference between the sum of strong base cations and or difference between that strong base cations and strong acid anions, and dissolved inorganic carbon, just the sum total of all the different carbon species. And we can see that weathering generates alkalinity. So if we take our calcium silicate and we dissolve it with protons, we get out calcium ions, but no anion, so we're generating alkalinity. And we can also see that weathering generates DIC, right? If we dissolve calcium carbonate with protons, we get carbonic acid, which is one of these species that makes up DIC. Now, I've done a little bit of a trick. I've written these as half reactions. I've not told you where the protons come from. And this is where we can start to introduce this idea of strong acid weathering. So canonically, we think that CO2 is the main acid source. However, what about sulfuric acid? And this forms when we take minerals like pyrite, these iron sulfide, and expose them to molecular oxygen. And the product we get is sulfuric acid. And this can drive chemical weathering reactions just the same as carbonic acid. And you might intuit that's going to have a very different carbon cycle effect. And to quantify the different carbon cycle effects of all possible combinations of silicate weathering and carbonate weathering with either CO2 or sulfuric acid, we just need to write all of these reactions in a consistent, formal manner and figure out what do they do to alkalinity and DIC. So we did, and I'll show you graphically what we sort of get. So this is a plot of alkalinity concentrations on the x-axis, and this is for the ocean, and DIC concentrations on the y, and the colored contours are the sort of equilibrium partial pressure of CO2. And you can see that these yellow colors, these are higher CO2, bluer colors are lower CO2. And we can then now draw for each chemical weathering reaction where it moves us in terms of alkalinity and DIC. And I just want to highlight this gray arrow. This is carbonate weathering by sulfuric acid. So if we're able to generate strong acids in the environment and we use those to drive chemical weathering, it actually leads to an increase in the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. Sort of works backwards to the way we expect traditional weathering to work, where we take silicate minerals and react them with CO2, and this generates alkalinity, and so it leads to lower CO2 levels. So if we go to an environment and want to understand, is weathering here drawing CO2 down or releasing it, we just need to measure all of these different chemical reactions and sort of add them up and figure out in net where they're moving us in this kind of plot. And that's what we're able to do with a couple, fancy different geochemical steps. And so I'm going to spare all those steps and just sort of show what we get for our Andes Amazon data. And so what we need to know to sort of solve the system of all the cations we get from carbonate and silicate weathering, what fraction are coming from the weathering of carbonates, it's plotting here on the X, and on the Y of all of that cation release from weathering, what fraction was driven by strong acids, or this oxidation of sulfide minerals, versus sort of CO2, or the sort of canonical acid source. And we can see our mountain catchments, these triangles, they are dominated by strong acid weathering. Something like 80–90% of all of the weathering is driven by sulfuric acid from pyrite oxidation, and a sort of substantial amount of those cations are coming from carbonates. And so we're actually able to figure out that this means that these catchments are an instantaneous release of CO2 to the atmosphere because of how they're affecting the ocean. As we go to the mountain front, these squares, these kind of straddle the boundary between what we might think of as CO2 release over million-year timescales and the sort of difference between long and short term. This happens to relate to the complexities about how we treat the ocean alkalinity cycle. But nevertheless, it's kind of right on this boundary between release and consumption. So we might conclude that essentially there's no effect on the carbon cycle. And as we get to the floodplains, we're seeing that there's evidence for CO2 drawdown, or weathering working the way we should. So we have the mountains are a CO2 source, and floodplains are a CO2 sink. Now, not to belabor the point too much, but this is, in mountains, weathering working the exact backwards way we expect it to, right? We always are taught and think that weathering draws CO2 down, but here we have direct evidence it releases CO2 back out. And you might wonder, is this some weird thing about the Andes that are special? It turns out if we go to other mountain ranges, Himalaya, Taiwan, New Zealand, we see the same signal. And perhaps more importantly, we actually can predict it from theory. So this is a reactive transport model that I adapted from Darcy Lee and Andy Jacobson. I won't go into the details of this plot too much, but the point is we can take a real rock, something that's got like a weight percent pyrite, something you could hold in your hand, and we can sort of say, well, would that small amount of pyrite overwhelm a much larger amount of silicate mineral, say like 9 weight percent plagioclase, and lead to CO2 release? And it turns out if we can get fast uplift rates, that can happen. And so there's this idea that there's this uplift or tectonic control on whether or not weathering environments consume or release CO2. And that's sort of important if we go back to our Cenozoic test case, right? We know that there's this increase in mountain uplift, right? The Himalayas didn't exist, and then they did. There's also uplift in the Andes, New Zealand, Taiwan, all these places I mentioned before. And these should be increasing global weathering. Like that's what we see from that correlation. But the question is, are they affecting the carbon cycle the same way? And so what we've done is added up all those different catchments and sort of mountain ranges and figured out, well, what is the net drawdown of CO2? So we have our traditional silicate weathering, which draws CO2 down, but we can subtract off, well, how much CO2 we're getting from strong acid weathering and look at just the net. And that's what we have in orange here. And you can see it's sort of flat, it increases, and then it gets flat again. And this is sort of interesting because if we compare it to our PCO2 proxies, so these are measurements of ancient levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, we get the same pattern. It's flat, it drops, and it's flat again. So we think that by adding sulfide oxidation as this carbon source, that we can reconcile sort of the data with our models and sort of this requirement of carbon cycle mass balance. So one of the reasons that mountain uplift doesn't lead to this sort of runaway kind of snowball Earth type global cooling is because mountain uplift is dominated by strong acid weathering, which has the opposite carbon cycle effect. So just kind of naturally, some of these components of the Earth system give rise to potentially greater stability. Instead of tectonic forcing being a greater driver, we kind of have this internal buffering that might be important. And we don't just see this in tectonically active environments, but we also kind of see this interesting evidence where if we go to catchments covered by glaciers, we also see that maybe sulfuric acid weathering is enhanced. So this is just river chemistry data for world rivers, the 50 largest rivers where there's a glacier in the catchment, and then this gray glow-rich points are 1 million samples from 10,000 rivers all over the planet. So the red and the blue, the gray and the red, these are just different ways of taking what is average river, and they agree with each other in terms of, let's say, their sulfate concentrations to sodium. But these glacial rivers are on average, and also kind of that shape of that distribution, more enriched in sulfate than the typical average river. And at the same time, also enriched in calcium. And so again, this idea that there's this coupling between carbonate weathering by sulfuric acid, you might interpret that then it means that glacial catchments also show this sign of enhanced strong acid weathering. And that's sort of this interesting idea that we sort of walk through. You can sort of imagine, right, that if we have CO2 going, relating to glacial area, where if we have lower CO2, we have more area covered by glacier. And if we have more area covered by glacier, we might have more CO2 release as a consequence of strong acid weathering. So if we have some underlying forcing driving CO2 out of the atmosphere, we're going to reach some threshold where we have enough glacial area that we compensate for that forcing and stabilize climate at some lower level. And over the most recent, let's say 100,000 years where we have data, we actually see a drawdown in oxygen in the atmosphere, which is exactly what you expect if there's this glacial strong acid weathering, right? We need oxygen to drive the generation of sulfuric acid. And this is sort of interesting, right? Because it sort of poses this question. Well, if glaciers, or if there's a fundamental limit to glaciation because glaciers are dominated by strong acid weathering, does that help explain why the time periods where we see globally extensive glaciations, like sort of snowball Earth events, are restricted to time periods of Earth's history where we lack high levels of atmospheric oxygen? Because that's the critical ingredient we need to allow for this regulation via strong acid weathering. And I just kind of want to highlight some work that sort of this Preston Kemeny, who's a grad student at Caltech that I work with, who's doing, we sort of got this NSF grant funded to really study how this works in Iceland. And just here's a snapshot of us measuring sulfur in rivers in Iceland, where we can really tease out what this glacial effect is. And I end with one sort of random thing, and then I'll conclude. And this idea of like, are humans having an impact on strong acid weathering? And I just kind of want to note, this is a map of fertilizer application rates. Fertilizers are rich in ammonia, which oxidizes with oxygen, making nitric acid. And we can drive carbonate weathering with nitric acid, and that might be a CO2 source. And we're also probably liming a lot of these agricultural catchments. So we might wonder, globally, what's the human impact of strong acid weathering? And this is something we're really interested in, sort of working on now. And I just highlight this other paper where we got this idea from. So it's a good read. And with that, I will take any questions and thank you for listening. And to sort of mention that there's a postdoctoral research fellowship position available in our department at Rice.
Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. If folks have questions, we have time for an extended question and answer session. We also have the ability to bring you onto mic to ask your question if you would like to do so. So just let us know in the Q&A box, and we can hopefully Ollie can. I'm not sure how to do it. Can bring you on live. We have a question about how conditional is mountain uplift in triggering strong acid weathering and CO2 release on the lithologies involved in uplift. In other words, is it always a given that mountain uplift will release CO2, or will some terrains draw down CO2?
Yeah, so I think the question is right on in that you need sulfide-rich rock. So like if you have, really small amounts of metal sulfide in the underlying rock, like it's a pure granite or a pure basalt or something, yeah, it might not be the case that you can ever have strong acid overwhelm silicate weathering. Now, just looking at modern mountain belts, Himalaya, Andes, Taiwan, they're uplifting marine sedimentary rocks that are very sulfide rich. And so it appears to be the rule that the way the Earth works is that it predominantly recycles sedimentary rocks as opposed to weathering sort of fresh, igneous materials, at least today. There might be kind of an evolution of that in time that would be sort of very interesting to look at. But sort of empirically, it appears that in most mountain belts today, they're uplift of these sulfide-rich sedimentary rocks. Now, but again, just from like in general, right, if you are uplifting a terrain that lacks those kinds of minerals, you're right that you would not get a sulfuric acid effect. And so this is something other people have talked about and I think is really interesting, but the development of volcanic islands, in which case you might have exposure of lots of very reactive silicates that might be associated with less metal sulfides, in which case there might be only a signal of CO2 drawdown.
Thanks. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A, but I actually have, which means I get to ask my question.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the potential feedbacks with the GOE. So you mentioned sort of the potential for, well, I'm just wondering if you think that enhanced sulfidic weathering after the GOE could have produced some feedbacks that interacted with the climate. I'm thinking in particular about the snowball earth, the Paleoproterozoic snowball earths. Yeah. Do you think that there could have been some feedback there that would have potentially been able to, I guess it would have helped us to sort of get out of the snowball?
Yeah, I mean, this is where there's so many details of snowballs. There's so many of them, and which ones occurred with and without oxygen. It gets complicated. So I don't have a great answer. And also, there's this other thing of like our capacity. If we start doing, like, if you want a CO2 release in net from strong acid weathering, you kind of have to have a consumption of oxygen. And the sort of reason there being that you undo the CO2 release when you do sulfate reduction in marine sediments. You can sort of think about, you make pyrite, you get an effect, or you dissolve pyrite, you have an effect, but once you remake the pyrite, it sort of takes you back to where you were. So in that sense, right, if we want to be driving CO2 release for a long time period, we have to have this consumption of oxygen. So it's possible, and this is maybe at the limit of our resolution of how we know oxygen levels have varied over the Precambrian, that you could have sometimes when, even if you have a little bit of oxygen, you overwhelm that reservoir and shut off sulfuric acid weathering, and that's some component of what's going on with the CO2 cycle. But this is something I'd be sort of really interested in looking at more. I don't have a great answer, but yeah, so I think oxygen is important, and it could play some role. And you can imagine scenarios also like, if you didn't, you have no oxygen, all of a sudden you have oxygen, you start doing strong acid weathering, that's a new CO2 source. And that causes an imbalance in the carbon cycle, in which then you have to correct by having more weathering, and that draws CO2 back down. And if the system can't really stabilize itself because we don't have well-developed feedbacks, like let's say low oxygen, you might trigger some really weird carbon cycle perturbations in the aftermath. But that's really speculating.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really interesting question. And Craig Walton, I think, has, he was also asking about, following up on that, asking about the large Paleoproterozoic carbon isotope excursion, the Loma-Gundy-Getuli event.
Yeah.
Do you think that that could also be linked somehow into this a similar story?
Yeah, that's really hard for me to comment on. I really don't like. I've not thought too much about that. Potentially, I mean, I don't see why not. And I think though, like maybe just highlighting some of that other work. My vague understanding, a lot of this sort of thinking about early strong acid weathering is focused around the story about metals. And I didn't really talk about metals at all, but it is the case that if we go to most of these, like our catchments in Peru, we've measured all sort of metal concentrations. They are absolutely loaded with a ton of metals, and these actually play important roles in different metabolisms and would have an impact on marine chemistry sort of as nutrients. And so in that respect, right, we can imagine that if you suddenly turn this on, you're going to really change nutrient fluxes to the ocean as well. And those might have these really complex feedbacks of like potentially driving organic carbon burial. And also if you're sort of mining a sort of carbonate reservoir, you're changing the isotope composition of carbon inputs to the ocean. And all of these levers together might help you better explain a really large carbon isotope excursion. But I haven't really myself worked at the math of like whether I believe that would, how big of a role it could plausibly play. Because I know that like those carbon isotope excursions are very hard to explain just because of their sheer magnitude.
That's great. Thanks very much. Vincent Clementi says, great talk. You show here that acid weathering in the Andes act as a rapid source of carbon. And there was a recent paper showing pyrite oxidation on continental shelves during glacial low stands may also be an important carbon source. So his question is, how overlooked is sulfur mineral weathering in our understanding of glacial interglacial carbon cycling?
Yeah, so this is a topic that, so I'm aware of the paper that you're referencing. It's a sort of interesting one. Something I've thought a little bit about, and also sort of mentioned Bob Hilton and his group. They've also been doing some work thinking about the oxidation of kerogen, which is really kind of similar in its carbon cycle effects to the oxidation of sulfides. And I would say there's this emerging evidence, there's some role of glaciation in driving CO2 release in the river catchments themselves, but also, like you say, potentially changing sea level and exposing, marine sediments that were previously anoxic. What might be missing is kind of really putting that in an Earth system model to really kind of understand, what is the potential role here, and that might be something worth doing. And maybe kind of to take that question in a different direction, what I think is sort of interesting is this idea of like phasing. So today we are saying that glacial catchments are CO2 sources, but we're in an interglacial period. So is that effect of glaciation the biggest when glaciers have retreated a little bit, or is it the biggest when we have peak glaciation? And because that's really going to impact, right, if we're thinking about glacial interglacial cycles of how we model that and what its ultimate effect is. Like, when is CO2 release the biggest? Peak glacial or peak interglacial, or sometime in between? And to me, that's not perfectly resolved yet. And it's a little bit of the motivation of the work we're doing in Iceland to try to sort of figure out, catchments that are glaciated today versus 10,000 years ago. Can we map out what physically is driving the sort of unique chemistry we observe?
Great. We'll just keep the question session open. For those of you that aren't aware, Jen has not managed to join us yet, so we'll keep the questions going as long as we have them. Rich Katz is asking, does weathering of ultramafic rocks produce strong acid, and could this be relevant as well?
Oh, that's a question I don't know the answer to. I don't know off the top of my head, and this is like my igneous petrology professor will probably get mad at me for sort of forgetting like how sulfur concentrations evolve between ultramafic rocks versus felsic. Off the top of my head, I want to say that like gabbros, which are obviously not ultramafic, but because they're sort of intrusive igneous, are pretty sulfur rich. And I don't know if that then carries over to ultramafic rocks also being sulfur rich, but I think it sort of matters like what the sort of sulfide concentrations are. And I'll have to sort of divert maybe to one of the sort of panelists that's more of an igneous petrologist than I am.
Did you have anything to add to that, Rich?
No.
Fair enough.
I vaguely remember, hearing from maybe Peter Kellerman, who was working on CO2 drawdown using ultramafic rocks, that there's production of there's acid springs, or there's some strong acid in these systems. And I wondered, it was just a random connection, but since we were a bit low on questions, I thought I'd take the chance and throw it out there.
Yeah, no, I'll have to do some research and figure that out.
I had a question actually about kinetics, if it's all right for me to jump in, Aubrey, which was just the kinetic. How much is known about the kinetics of the oxidation process, and then the competition in terms of the sulfuric acid weathering versus the CO2 weathering, and how do they differently respond to the environment and environmental changes in a kind of feedback sense?
Yeah, this is a challenge, right? Like there's lots of lab kinetic data for silicates and for sulfides. And the question is how can we effectively use that to model real systems? And there's this often quoted discrepancy where it appears that everything that's happening in our laboratories is way faster than we observe it in nature. And exactly why that is the case, we don't fully know. And so in that sense, right, like there's a limitation here on sort of kinetics that we really don't fully understand. At the same kind of side, if we just look in most mountain catchments today, or just river catchments around the world, like detrial pyrite is essentially extremely rare or not ever observed. And so whatever's going on with sulfides, like there's very few places on Earth we can find where they don't all react and get completely oxidized. Whereas detrial silicates are incredibly common. So at least from that kind of evidence, we sort of see, oh, right, it must be that, for most types of tectonic environments, sulfide oxidation can keep pace, and we sort of never overwhelm the environment's capacity to oxidize sulfides, and that's not the case for silicates. There are weird examples where you get landslides that kind of dump material straight into river catchments, and you get detrial sulfide, but even then, or detrial pyrites, but then even then, sort of the length scale which that's transported, incredibly small. So I think there's definitely more work to be done in sort of the kinetic realm, and I sort of people are starting to do that with sort of better reactive transport models, but I think there's still some open questions with that. Like one that's really interesting, if you sort of take closed system, and this is like work Sue Brantley has done, if you take, or Sue's done it, and also I think it's a Dominic Wolf-Bonish paper about this too. Like there's more sulfate in rivers than you'd expect for closed system oxygen concentrations, right? If we equilibrate water with the atmosphere, it goes down in the subsurface, oxidizes pyrite. You should only get a certain sulfate concentration for that, if it was just closed system consumption of oxygen. And we always see way more sulfate in rivers from pyrite oxidation. So there must be some mechanism of open system oxygen transport into the subsurface. And we don't, and that's going to be sort of clearly important for the kinetics, and we don't really understand how that works.
Yeah, and I guess another thing I was thinking about, and it's probably kind of ultimately related to maybe the kinetics or kind of timescales, which was this observation you made about the mountains being a CO2 source, but the floodplains providing the balance to that by then doing the silicate weathering. And I guess the residence time material in the floodplains is potentially a lot longer than it is in the mountains.
Yeah.
But it made me wonder, like, what, in terms of like the life cycle of a mountain, about like how is the floodplain environment evolving over that time, and how how should we view mountain formation as kind of a net CO2 source or sink over kind of the uplift, growth, expansion, floodplain growth kind of period?
Yeah, no, I'm incredibly interested in that. I think it's a really interesting idea. And like, I don't know yet, and something I want to work on. But along those lines, I would sort of point out where people try to measure it. And this is stuff, I think, Julian Boucher and Martin Lübker, of looking at the sort of Himalaya mountains and the Andes Amazon. And this idea of, well, there's the Ganges floodplain, and you can say of all of the weathering in the Himalayan system, mountains and floodplain, what fraction takes place in the floodplain? And it's something like 70%, or that's the estimate. If you go to the Andes Amazon, you ask the same question, of all the weathering, what fraction takes place in the floodplain? It's something like 25%. And like, why? Like, why is the floodplain dominant in one place and not the other? And I think that's an outstanding question. And sort of, it's sort of important to what you're saying of like, well, if we think about uplift as creating both mountains and floodplains, we sort of wonder, like in times in Earth's history, we're making more, Ganges floodplains or more Amazon floodplains, because they have really different effects on the silicate weathering part. And it also, like you're saying, could be a time evolution thing. And is there an expected evolution of initially CO2 release and then eventually relaxing to CO2 sink? And I think those are all really interesting questions to try to work out.
Yeah, and it also makes me wonder about different tectonic settings in which you have mountain building as well.
Yeah.
Like, Himalaya style versus, kind of Andean uplift where you've got right next to the ocean and a trench there, and whether that also changes that kind of balance.
Yeah. I mean, probably totally expect. I mean, because if you need some place to store sediments for a long time, right? Like something like a New Zealand or Taiwan, it's kind of steep mountains straight into the ocean, and that stuff kind of gets locked away really quick. And you don't get the chance to weather these silicates, which are much slower, but are the sort of mechanism for drawing CO2 down.
I'm curious about the nitric acid weathering that you mentioned. Does that require ammonium oxidation? And what's the sort of mineralogical precursor to that? I mean, what kind of terrains or minerals do you get that from?
Yeah, so I guess that was I was sort of I mean, there is slight amounts of ammonia, but I was more thinking of it that we're dumping fertilizer all over, Earth's surface, and we need that, right, to grow plants. But then there's this potentially underappreciated biogeochemical process that, well, if they're ammonia-rich fertilizers, they can oxidize, but maybe we're also dumping sort of nitrate-rich fertilizers. But all these sorts of things can produce strong acids that might also start driving weathering reactions. And so it's interesting to think about, what is this another example of strong acid weathering in the environment? It's not mineral-based, but it's sort of anthropogenic based of sort of our distribution of different fertilizers. And exactly, and this sort of gets this question of like, what is the effect of human activity on the environment? Like, there's a lot of interest that like, agriculture would make a bunch of, it's a potential sink for carbon in, agricultural soils or biomass, and or trying to drive enhanced weathering in agricultural systems of like dumping silicates. But maybe as sort of a counterpoint to that, or something we'll have to worry about in competition is, well, there's also enormous potential for strong acid generation in agricultural systems because of our nitrogen applications.
Just to follow up on that, is it observed that sediments being produced, or sediments in rivers near where there's significant agriculture, exhibit they're more deeply weathered, they're more heavily weathered than rivers that don't have that kind of anthropogenic influence? Like, you can actually see it in something that's ending up in the geological record, I guess, is another way of putting it.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know if that's the case, but that'd be interesting to look at. I know there are a lot of people have definitely looked at those types of questions, but off the top of my head, I don't remember the results of like how big of a signal you see of are chemical fluxes from agriculture catchments enhanced. I think a little bit of that's going to be a challenge because we are dumping so much fertilizer and stuff, right? Like a lot of the potassium that rivers like didn't come leached from the rocks. We put it there. So there might be a little bit of a trick of trying to calculate what is the the rock contribution, but it seems doable and might be kind of an interesting approach.
Another part of the Anthropocene era.
Yeah.
Is there any other last questions? Well, if not, I will say thank you very much to Mark for taking the reins on this. That was really interesting. We had a really fun discussion. And thanks to everyone who's attending via Zoom and our YouTube. Please check out our webpage and Twitter feed to keep track of our upcoming seminars. And our next event will be in 2 weeks, when we will have a special UK-focused Earth-to-Earth seminar featuring Dr. Craig Poku from the University of Leeds and Naomi Rowe Gurney from the University of Leicester, who will be discussing the atmospheres of Earth and the ice giants Uranus and Neptune. So thanks a lot, everyone.